Falk. The name of the interviewer is Brenda Heppler. The date of the interview is January 15th, 2009. And so, Steve, we're just going to talk a little bit about personal questions relative to libraries, and then move on to the more general and Lafayette City specific questions. So, what are your first childhood memories of libraries?
I went to the public library in my hometown, which was Lakewood, California. I remember going there with my father, and he and I getting lost separately in the library in the books, and then on school evenings primarily, and then reconvening an hour or two later, both stimulated and refreshed from the experience.
Oh, great. And where did you grow up?
In Lakewood, California. The library there was called the Angelo Icaboni Library, and it was named for the deceased mayor of the town. It was a young man who had been the mayor in his 20s and died tragically, and so they named the library after him, and it stuck with me.
Okay, yeah, yes, it's a unique
Yeah.
name. And what awareness of community did you have while growing up?
Not a particularly strong awareness of community.
Okay. And your education?
I have a bachelor's degree in economics from Reed College and a master's degree in public policy from Harvard University.
Oh, very good. And your work experiences?
I've been a public servant for 22 years, having worked for the city of Long Beach, the San Francisco International Airport, and Lafayette. I've been with Lafayette for the last 18 years.
Very good. And as an adult, what were your early community experiences?
I was involved in some community organizing while I was in graduate school, primarily related to the anti-apartheid movement at Harvard. Very involved with putting together a rally of the community during that time. When we moved to San Francisco, I was involved with a couple different issues there. One was on street planting, urban tree planting program, and then I sat on the City and County of San Francisco Commission to develop a new ballpark for the San Francisco Giants, and that was very interesting.
Oh, yeah. And what attracted you to Lafayette?
I may differ from some of the other people you've spoken to, but it was a job. Yeah.
Funny how that works.
Yes.
And how long have you lived here?
We've lived in Lafayette for 11 years.
And defining the goals of a community as a place of mutual support, shared values, and the acceptance of difference, how do you see Lafayette meeting these goals?
Repeat the goals again.
The three issues. What makes up a goal? The goals of a community would be a place of mutual support, shared values, and acceptance of difference. How do you see Lafayette meeting those goals?
I think Lafayette does a good job at shared values. It seems to me that people self-select when they choose to move to Lafayette, and that those who do move to Lafayette are interested in one or both, typically interested in one or both of the following: the preservation of open space and or quality public education. In short, we call it green hills and great schools. It seems like people who move to Lafayette move here because they embrace those two ideas as core values, and there's, in my experience, is great agreement about the importance of those values. I'm not sure that we do as well on the other two.
Mutual support.
Mutual support, I would like to say that we do a great job, but the data doesn't really bear that out. We have coalesced around school tax measures and bond measures, which is an indicator of mutual support, community support. But on the other hand, we failed with 4 consecutive municipal tax measures related to fixing roads and increasing the police. If the community were really mutually supportive, I think they would be more likely to pass these tax measures. And then the third value was
acceptance of difference.
Acceptance of difference. You know, I'm not sure I have enough data to opine about this. My own experience is that people are generally pretty accepting. But on the other hand, I'm not very different from the majority of people here, so I don't think I can speak authoritatively about what it feels like to be a person of color or somebody from the gay, lesbian, transgender movement. So I don't really have a strong opinion about that.
All right, so you've been here 18 years. So going
yes.
back to when you came, what are your memories of the Lafayette Library when you came to Lafayette?
My memories, my first impressions were that it was poorly maintained, too small, and had inconvenient hours.
And how often do you personally use the library?
I'm not a big library user because the hours aren't convenient for me. They're open when I'm working, and their evening hours, they don't have a lot of evening hours, which is when I would normally go.
So how do you feel a library serves a community?
Libraries are changing. Libraries around the country are evolving to meet the needs, the various needs of the community. And through this process of building the Lafayette Library, or designing and building the Lafayette Library and Learning Center, I've been able to visit dozens of other libraries to see this evolution in place and in practice. I think it's fair to say that libraries are less often serving as a mere repository of books and more often serving as a community center. In some cases, just as a community information center where people might not come in for a book at all, but rather to log on to the internet or to read a magazine. But in other cases, it's more than just information. There will be a series of meeting rooms where you can gather with a book club or with a tutor. In other cases, there will be a larger community facility attached, meeting facility attached to the library where speakers can be heard or city council meetings can take place. Some libraries have coffee shops attached where you might convene with an old friend to have a cafe mocha and a croissant. Other libraries have gone so far as to include historic archives. Others have got entertainment modules or opportunities. I know the San Francisco Main Library, you can go in and pick out a movie and then watch the movie in the library. Yeah. So they are evolving to meet the community's needs.
How have you been involved in the library, of course, through your job over the years, and if so, in what way? So as a city manager, what has been your involvement with this new library?
I've been very involved with the library.
So maybe you just talk us about the experiences.
Yeah. My involvement ranged from helping the community come to a conclusion very early on about where a new library should be located. And so we did a lot of analysis to help determine what the best spot for a new library would be. And then we were involved, once the site had been selected, in working out a deal with the veterans so that they would abandon that site to make room for a new library. And that was a very exciting project in and of itself.
Any stories to tell?
Well, I've got a lot of stories. I mean, that could be a whole oral history project in itself. Yeah, because working with crusty old veterans who have occupied their clubhouse for 40, sometimes 50 years, and helping them reach a conclusion that it was in their interest and in the community's interest to, like I said, abandon that site for a new hall. That was a challenge. It was interesting. It was engaging. It was fun. I got to meet a group of guys, all men, who I otherwise wouldn't have had much interaction with. These are World War II veterans and Korean War veterans and Vietnam War veterans, and they are highly ethical but strongly opinionated, and there were challenges all along the way, as you might imagine, ranging from choosing the new site, the site where a new Veterans Hall would be located, to selecting an architect, and then working with the architect and the veterans through the design process and coming up with a design that was acceptable to the veterans but also would be beautiful and a lasting monument to the veterans and their service, all the way down to just the smallest details, such as what types of chairs would be appropriate and would be comfortable to veterans with disabilities, to working with the veterans to commission an artist to make a painting for that building, which was really the focal point of the room, to choosing names for the different areas in the building, working with veterans because the names of the rooms were symbolic. So much of that building was laden with symbolism and sought or seeks to honor the service that, in that aspect, that overlay of the historicity and the sentimentalism and the community's desire to honor veterans really made that project exceptionally interesting and challenging.
It's wonderful to hear more about the veterans too. So any other stories? All right, so you have the Veterans Building now. What were the ongoing experiences after you achieved agreement with the veterans, and then after that?
Well, after that, then we had to build the building, and it was an expensive project, and as we proceeded through the design and the bid process, it occurred to us that it would be good to have additional funding to pay for this. And at that time, there was a developer in town named Tak Hirahara who had developed the Tiffany's Center in Walnut Creek. And he was looking for other development opportunities in Walnut Creek. And located just behind that center was the Walnut Creek Veterans Building. And so Tak approached me and suggested that one way for us to help fund this new Veterans Building would be to enter into a partnership with the Walnut Creek veterans. And by selling both the Lafayette Veterans Hall and the Walnut Creek Veterans Building, we could use the proceeds from both halls to fund this new Veterans Building. Interestingly, that's why the new Veterans Building is referred to as the Veterans Memorial Building and not the Lafayette Veterans Memorial Building, because it wound up being a joint project of the Lafayette Redevelopment Agency, the City of Walnut Creek, and Contra Costa County. It was a very unique partnership. The city won a very big, prestigious award called the Helen Putnam Award for Innovation because we put that partnership together. The partnership with Walnut Creek delivered about $1 million in extra funding that allowed us to build this beautiful building in Lafayette. So that was interesting. The design review process was interesting for the Veterans Building. When it was originally proposed by the architect, it was a building very much in the same shape currently exists, but it was largely a stucco building. Community members attended some of those design review commission meetings and said that they felt that stucco was not appropriate. The building needed to have a greater sense of timelessness. So the Design Review Commission ordered that the building be clad with granite. And this added about $1 million in cost. So it was even better that Walnut Creek came in with this extra $1 million. And by all accounts was the right decision. It gives that building a sense of permanence because it's made of stone that stucco wouldn't have conveyed. The poor mason that was hired to do that work underbid the project and wound up losing so much money that my understanding is it went bankrupt, and it took months longer than that company anticipated. So it was really a very tense building project. The budget was very tight, but as we said at the time, during the particularly high-stress moments, nobody will recall how much it cost or whether it was a month or two delayed, but people will appreciate the beautiful building for what it is, and I think that has been borne out. By all accounts, that building is a success. The veterans love it, the people love it, the users love it. It serves as a wonderful entry point as you enter downtown from the west. Because it's made of granite, it's got an organic, of-the-earth feel, and so as you transition from that feeling of open space as you pass by the reservoir, this is a very nice kind of organic statement that you see, but at the same time elegant and prominent.
And certainly an integral part of the library story.
And integral part of the library story.
I really appreciate you bringing it out. On to the library then, the development of the library. After everything was agreed upon by the veterans and that situation had been completed, your involvement with the development of the library as city manager.
Once we had acquired the veterans site and moved the veterans off, well, actually simultaneous to the building of the veterans building, once we knew we had control of the library site, we began immediately on a process for designing the new library. There had been, other folks had managed a series of studies related to what the users wanted to see in the library. They did a needs analysis. So we knew kind of what features people wanted to see in the library. And the first task at that point then became to hire an architect. My staff and I managed that process, but we were committed to making it a community process, and we received direction from the City Council. Our first task was to develop kind of a laundry list of architects who might be good for this job. And so we went to the American Architect Association, or American Association of Architects. And we gathered a list of all the architects in the West who had won major awards for library design. And if I recall correctly, we had a list of about 15 architects. We then sent them a request for proposals. I believe 11 responded, said that they would be interested in doing this work, with a series of glossy brochures and statements as to why they might be well qualified. I believe we narrowed that list to, memory is faulty, but it was 4 or 6 or 7 architects who were then asked to compete for the job. And we ran an architecture competition. If I recall correctly, 4 architects wound up participating in the competition, and each had to prepare a model, a 3-dimensional model, and 2 sets of boards that included floor plans and drawings. I think each architect was paid $5,000 or $10,000 to participate in the competition, and they had some finite number of days to prepare the model and the boards. And this is all presuming that the library would go on the site where the Veterans Building was. And so then they arrived with their models and their boards, and we put the models and the boards at the we displayed them at the old Veterans Building for a weekend. And we had sent notice to the community to come to the old Veterans Building and make comments about which design they liked. And it was a rainy weekend. It was the worst weather imaginable for this type of thing, but we received something like 1,100 cards with comments. At one point, the line snaked all the way out of the building and stretched out along the street, even in the rain. People from the community were very eager to see these visions for what the library could be and let their opinion be known. At the staff level, after the weekend was over, we gathered up these cards and we summarized them, transcribed them, and typed them and summarized them by types of comment. And then there was a large community meeting where a panel of professionals, design, and I believe a panel of architecture and design professionals reviewed and critiqued the models and then made a recommendation to the City Council. And I believe they made a unanimous or nearly unanimous recommendation based upon the design, based upon the comments from the public, that this firm, Killefer Flameng, be hired. That was just a very exciting time. I thought we did a good job of soliciting community input. And it was also just very interesting to see how extremely different the visions for the library, the new library, from the architects, various architects, were. To my mind, the Killefer Fleming design was superior to the others, and that it just shone through. It rose above, the cream rose to the top of the milk, and so I wasn't surprised, and I was in fact gratified when they were selected. The next, go ahead.
No, go on.
Kind of the next big milestone then after the design, after the architect was selected, is we did some early design work, and then I think the next big kind of, if I recall, big piece was to prepare this grant application for state funding. This was a very big deal. At the time, the state of California had passed a bond measure to fund, it was called the Library and Literacy Bond Measure, and it was designed specifically to fund the development of libraries in communities in California. There was a finite amount of money available. It was something like $300 million. They were giving it out in 3 rounds of about $100 million each. We were not ready for the first 2 rounds, so we had one chance at this, and it was in the last round. They had roughly $100 million to give in the last round. They received, it was a competitive grant. They received something like 80 applications, or applications from 80 different California jurisdictions, from Humboldt all the way down to San Diego. And the application process was extremely onerous and difficult. We spent a lot of time in the city offices here working with some very important community members to talk about how to position ourselves to win that grant.
So in preparing the grant, it was a combination of community members and the city?
Absolutely,
Okay.
yeah. The city staff was responsible for the actual kind of technical preparation of the grant, and we worked literally day and night. There were some all-nighters that we were working on. But the concept of what the grant would say and how we would position Lafayette to win this grant was entirely a community effort. We knew that with just $100 million available and dozens of applicants, that it was a long shot, particularly given that this was a literacy improvement grant, and given Lafayette's high literacy standards, that it was not just a long shot, but a near impossibility. And so I can recall sitting in a conference with some of these very early library organizers and talking about what can we do to grab the attention of the grant makers, the grant givers. And we knew it had to be something more than spectacular design. It had to be something more than a partnership with the local school district, because we knew we were competing against communities that had very big literacy issues. And the phrase we used was that we needed not a single or a double or a home run. We needed a grand slam. It had to be an idea that was so compelling that the state library bond board would be unable to resist. We gathered in a meeting one day where we were brainstorming about this, and we knew that partnerships with the schools was going to be important, and so we had asked a school board member to attend the meeting, and it was a fellow named Roger Falcone, who at the time was the chair of the Department of Physics at UC Berkeley and also sat on the board of directors of the Lawrence Hall of Science. So Roger, at this meeting, suggested that perhaps we could have a partnership with the Lawrence Hall of Science, and that by doing so it would help our application. Roger's logic was that at the Lawrence Hall they have a large exhibition space, but they have rotating exhibitions. They have material and curricula and displays that sit in the basement most of the year, and then they rotate them up to the exhibition space. Roger asked, would it not be in Lawrence Hall's interest to bring some of their materials out to the Lafayette Library? They could do it at no cost and at the same time increase their exposure to the community. So he thought it would be consistent with their mission. And so the committee felt like this was a good idea. They encouraged Roger to go meet with Lawrence Hall. He did. He met with Elizabeth Stage, who's the executive director. And she said, yes, we would like to be a partner. So Roger came back to the group a week or two later and said, I've got good news. Lawrence Hall will be our partner. And at that, everybody was very happy and excited. And then the one fellow in the corner of the room was very quiet. And rather than congratulating Roger, he seemed to be kind of taciturn and not particularly congratulatory. And so somebody turned to Bob Fisher and said, well, Bob, what are your thoughts on this? And Bob scratched his bald head and said, well, if this works for the Lawrence Hall of Science, if this idea of this partnership of leveraging the urban asset into the suburban community at virtually no cost works for Lawrence Hall of Science, why wouldn't it also work for every other major cultural institution in the Bay Area? And nobody had a good rebuttal to Dr. Fisher's question. And so after some discussion, Bob Fisher was tasked with calling a dozen or so leading Bay Area cultural institutions and seeing if they too would be interested in serving as partners at the Lafayette Library and Learning Center. So he goes away for a couple of weeks and then comes back and he says, every single one of them would like to do this. And thus was born the Glen Seaborg Learning Consortium, which we then packaged into the state grant application. And I remember writing the executive summary, the first page of that grant. And the first sentence of the grant application, when the grant maker opened up the packet, the first sentence said, this has never been tried before. This idea to bring a spacesuit from an urban museum into a suburban library, this idea to bring zoo animals into the suburban community, this idea to bring speakers from the Commonwealth Club out into the suburbs. This idea is an idea that could revolutionize and transform libraries across the nation. This is the Glen Seaborg Learning Consortium. That was the opening page of our $11.9 million grant request. And so we thought that we had a grand slam. We thought that this idea could conceivably carry the day against the other 79 competitors. We crunched, my staff worked very hard, and Meredith, the Community Development Director, deserves tremendous credit for writing a grant application that filled 4 large boxes and had to be driven in a van to Sacramento. We delivered it. We were happy about 9 months later to hear that we were one of the top candidates, but then there was to be a public hearing before the library bond board where the final decision would be made. And we drove to Sacramento with a van full of library supporters, entered this room at the Sheraton Hotel in Sacramento, and there were 1,000 people from all over the state. It was a raucous crowd. People had dressed in colors. They were all, people from Orange were all dressed in orange. The people from another community had made placards and were waving them, saying, support our library. The bond board consisted of, I believe it was 9 individuals. And it was an all-day long hearing where each of the 80 cities was able to make the presentation for just 3 minutes. And then at the end of the day, they would deliberate. Lafayette was scheduled to make its presentation to the State Library Bond Board at sometime just after lunch. We'd brought a contingency of a dozen or 15 people up to support our application, including Gloria Duffy, who was the CEO of the Commonwealth Club, and Elizabeth Stage, who was the executive director of the Lawrence Hall of Science. And we had spent days in advance of this hearing preparing our 3-minute pitch. It was very scripted. We had blown up these big boards that included our arguments, our main arguments. We had spent the weekend in the city offices rehearsing our little script. So we sat through the morning and listened to the many other cities who were making their presentations. And we heard from representatives from some of the poorest cities in the entire state of California. I can recall the mayor of Orange Cove, which is a small, very poor farming community outside of Fresno, make their presentation where they spoke about these extremely low literacy rates among the farm worker population and made a very strong argument for why they needed a new library. And then we heard also a presentation from the mayor of the city of San Bernardino, who spoke about how their library was non-functional, and this is for a population of several 100,000 people with literacy rates that were under 20%, I think. And so the general mood of the Lafayette contingent became darker as the day went on, and we heard more presentations. We gathered for lunch, agreed that we still needed to make our best presentation possible. And when our time came after lunch, I thought we did a fantastic job. Roger Falcone, who was the president of our school board at the time, made a great presentation. He was aided by Dr. Stage and Dr. Duffy, and I thought they really hit the ball out of the park. They talked about the Glen Seaborg Learning Consortium and how it really did differentiate the Lafayette project from others, and in fact could serve as a model for libraries across the country. And so we sat there as the rest of the cities made their presentations, and we heard presentations from 3 other cities in Contra Costa County, including Antioch and Walnut Creek and San Ramon. And finally all the presentations were over, and there was a short recess, and then the board reconvened and began to allocate this $80 million, roughly $100 million in money. And they had a big movie screen where they had projected a spreadsheet that showed the total amount available and how much was left after each grant that they made. And the board was very deliberate. They were very calm and reasoned about their decisions. And of course, San Bernardino got one of the early grants. And then Orange Cove got one of the early grants. And I don't think anybody who was from Lafayette would have argued that those weren't the right decisions. But at the same time, there was a kind of a mounting sense of anxiety that there wouldn't be money left over for our project. So they deliberated for an hour and a half, and they finally got down to where there was just, I believe it was about $18 million left. At which point the chair of the board, the Library Bond Board, said, I'd like to just stop the discussion. And I'd like to note that we only have enough money left to give 1 or 2 more grants. So I'd like to know how the board would like to proceed. And then she said, I would also like to just test out a notion. It would be interesting to go back and read the minutes because this is my recollection. She said, this was Susan Hildreth, who was the state librarian, who was chairing this board. She said, I would like to test out this notion among the board that we should reserve one of the final grants for a city in Contra Costa County. And the reason why she made that motion was because there were 4 cities from Contra Costa. None had received a grant so far. None had received a grant in the previous round either. And so she felt, just as a matter of fairness, that might be something that would be worth floating. And she also said Contra Costa has been a great supporter of libraries, been very progressive, and was looking for some way to reward the county. This created an instant buzz of excitement and renewed our hope that we might win a grant. But at the same time, we knew that the competition was very stiff because of the 4 cities who had made it to these finals, again, Walnut Creek, Antioch, San Ramon, and Lafayette, 3 of the 4 had gotten the top staff evaluation, with San Ramon receiving kind of a B. We got A's, and the San Ramon kind of got a B+. So we felt that it was really going to come down to either Antioch, Walnut Creek, or Lafayette. The board, by the way, agreed with Susan Hildreth and decided that they would make 1 grant, reserve 1 grant for a Contra Costa city. Immediately, let me just back up and say we knew this would be very contentious, and it became a very interesting political question because each of the 3 remaining Contra Costa cities had a strong argument. Lafayette's, of course, was that we felt we were the most innovative and could set a gold standard, a new paradigm for libraries across the country. Antioch had a very compelling case. They're a city that was not as affluent as either Lafayette or Walnut Creek. It was much larger, over 100,000, did not have a library, and had been a finalist in previous rounds. Walnut Creek had a compelling argument, not the least of which was that former Senator Richard Rainey, who had hailed from Walnut Creek, was one of the co-authors of this library bond bill. And he was sitting in the audience. and without his leadership, there would be no library bond bill. Walnut Creek also had submitted in each of the first 2 rounds and been highly rated, but had been unsuccessful. And so after the board made this decision to award one grant to a Contra Costa city, there was an immediate motion made to make the grant to Walnut Creek, and an immediate second with no discussion. The motion was made by Phil Angelides, who was associated with a law firm that a husband of the Walnut Creek council member worked for. And so Phil Angelides had very strong, he was the state treasurer at the time, but he had very strong ties to Walnut Creek. Meanwhile, one of the board members who was general counsel for K&B Homes, one of the largest home builders in the country, asked for a substitute motion that Antioch be awarded the grant, and that motion was seconded by another board member. And so now there were 2 competing motions before this grant-making board, one for Walnut Creek and one for Antioch, and they had a vigorous debate. And never once was the Lafayette grant mentioned. And we were sitting in the front row, and we were crestfallen. We felt that our chances were, at this point, had diminished to 0, that it was a fight between Walnut Creek and Antioch. And I know I felt, and everybody who had spent all this time writing this enormous grant and preparing that weekend before were feeling deflated. And interestingly, the board was deadlocked. They could not decide between Walnut Creek and Antioch. They each had the equal number of votes, and yet there were 3 members who had not signaled what their intention was going to be. So finally, after what seemed like an eternity, it was probably 20 minutes or 30 minutes of debate, a board member named Lois Falk, who was from, I believe, Woodland, which is a city up near Davis, said, "I've got a question for the board," and that is, we're deadlocked on the choice between Walnut Creek and Antioch, but we haven't even mentioned the Lafayette application. And at this point, our ears perked up, and it was as if there was the slightest ray of hope to capture this $11.9 million grant. And she said, "I just need to ask my board members if that's something that is worth discussing, because I felt that it was a really good application." And immediately afterwards, Susan Hildreth, who was the state librarian, followed Assemblywoman Locke's entree and said, "Well, in fact, when I read the Lafayette application, it seemed to me to be perhaps the most innovative of all of the applications that we received in this round. And so I do think that there would be merit in discussing the Lafayette application." And at that point, a 3rd member said, "I agree," and it was as if the tension between the Antioch and the Walnut Creek factions dissipated, because they recognized that they were backed into a corner, and that the Lafayette application was going to be the only application that could capture a majority. And so we went from a point where we felt we had no hope. We'd sat there all day long, felt like as if we had no hope, to within, I would estimate, 122nd, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, to a point where it was pretty clear we were going to win $11.9 million grant to build this new library. And the feeling of elation among the Lafayette contingent was indescribable. There was a motion and a second to make a grant to Lafayette, and then immediately afterwards there was a motion and a second to spend the remaining, would have been $8 or so million. And then the board closed off the hearing, and the whole thing was over. So we had spent this day, we had arrived at about 8 in the morning. It was now something like 6:30 or 7 at night. It had been 11 hours worth of hearings, and for the first 10 hours and 57 minutes, there wasn't a mention amongst the board about the Lafayette application or its merits. And in the last 3 minutes, because Assemblymember Falk from Woodland had brought it up and there was this deadlock between Walnut Creek and Antioch, we were successful. And we jumped out of our chairs and we began hugging each other, and Ann Groden was crying, and we ran up and we were thanking the board members effusively, and there was this incredible feeling, an outpouring of elation amongst the Lafayette delegation who was there. And yet at the same time, the feelings of disappointment from Walnut Creek and Antioch and all of the other cities who had sat all day long permeated the room. So you would imagine there were something like 10 cities won grants and the other 70 were disappointed. So there were hundreds of people who were dejected, and I remember feeling somewhat self-conscious about kind of celebrating in front of these many people, but it was something that you could not help but do. Because we knew, I think, at that moment, at whatever it was, 6:30 p.m. that night at the Sheraton, Sacramento, that this library, which had been an idea, it had been a kernel of an idea, but had no financial plan, we knew that now we could do it. Because once we had won that state grant, we knew we could go to the public and say, look, we've got a financial foundation to build this library. We knew we could build a campaign around that. And so in my mind, this was the span of time related to the entire building of this library. It was this 2 to 5 minute period at that Sacramento hotel where the project turned from an idea to a reality. And afterwards, we gathered in the cars and we were driving back on I-80, driving that stretch past Davis and through Vacaville, and we had our cell phones out and we were calling the newspapers to report the news. And I was driving, and I remember Ann Groden was in the back seat talking on the cell phone to a reporter, and I overheard her say, yes, she announced the news and she said, yes, we're driving on I-80 right now, but we might as well be flying. And I thought that really captured that moment. Yeah. That was a very big deal, and like I said, it really did set the stage for a successful library. The other point that I think is worth making is that this wasn't just the culmination of this 11-hour day, but it was something that really the city staff, led by Community Development Director Ann Meredith, had been working on for a year. We had spent a year preparing this most detailed application and working with the community volunteers to create this idea around the Glen Seaborg Learning Consortium and draw up these beautiful plans and gather volunteers and 100 community members in support and gather these 12 nonprofit cultural institutions in support of this idea. And so it was just such a poignant and important capstone to really what had been a year or more's worth of effort to build this library.
Why is this new library so important to you?
Well, it's important to me because it's important to the community, and I am a public servant. And I work for the community, and I'm employed by the community, and it's the community that funds my organization. And so because the community had set this out as its top priority, this was very important to me to achieve.
Because did you feel that the community had given you the...
It was very clear direction.
Yeah.
That they wanted to go in this.
Yes,
Yeah.
okay, great. What outcome do you hope for most with this new library?
Libraries has many different features to it that make it important. Hopefully it will be a beautiful architectural statement right in the heart of our downtown. I'm hopeful that it will serve all the purposes that a library traditionally serves, that it serves as a repository of fine books and as an information center where you can use computers to log onto the internet and do searches and research. I'm hopeful that it will serve as a fabulous children's library. This is something that Lafayette needs and has been lacking. But beyond that, I'm hopeful the library will become an important gathering point for the community, where you will meet people both formally and informally, where you might arrange to meet a book club in one of the meeting rooms there in kind of a formal way, but also you'll just by happenstance, because you're there for a program or picking up a book, you'll run into that long-lost friend who shared 4th grade with your daughter but you haven't seen in the last 6 years. Because that's how communities are strengthened. People feel that they do have interpersonal connections, and I think it's places like Little League fields and school auditoriums and libraries where we build these community bonds. One thing about communities that I think is interesting is that a lot of people develop their relationships in the community through their children when their kids are in schools. But once the kids move out, they don't have that same opportunity to interact with people from around town. They might still interact with their immediate neighbors, but somebody from Spring Hill might not necessarily have an opportunity to interact with somebody from Burton Valley. I'm hopeful that the library can allow people who no longer have kids or who never had kids to have opportunities to meet each other and work with each other either through volunteer opportunities or through programs that are brought forward by the members of the Glen Seaborg Learning Consortium, or just by happenstance, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and that answers the next question, so that's fine. And what transformation have you seen in Lafayette relative to this new library, as it's progressed?
I think this is the great untold story, and perhaps the most difficult to capture, is what the library has done, library really fundraising effort has done for the community. Once we won the state grant, we knew that we had funding for sort of two legs of the three-legged stool. There was the grant at roughly $12 million. There was roughly $12 million in money from the redevelopment agency. And then we needed roughly $11 million in private funding, and that was a gargantuan challenge to raise that much money privately. And this is a story that I think needs to be researched and needs to be told, and it's the story of hundreds of volunteers giving unselfishly of their time to not only time and money, not only to give their money, but also to ask their neighbors and friends for money, which is something that's not easy to do. And I would encourage you to speak with the many people who were involved with this fundraising effort, not the least of which have to include Ann Groden and Kathy Merchant, Gwen Lennox, and Lois Lane, and Hilma, Ann Appert, and these people were dogged in their determination to make this successful. They weren't afraid to try basically anything in order to make this library a success. If we had asked them to juggle balls and bounce them off the tops of their heads, they would have done that. They ran every imaginable event. They asked people to do things that were far beyond their comfort zone, and time again, the citizens of Lafayette delivered. And as the city manager of Lafayette, I do interact. I have good friends who are city managers in other communities. I'm aware of private fundraising efforts in other communities. And to my knowledge, I've never heard of anything quite like this before, where people have been so unstinting and unselfish with their time. And the results are there to prove it. As of this date, we have raised something like $14 million. We have, I think, over 2,000 so-called giving units. Something like more than 20% of all of the households in Lafayette have made a donation. In most cities, they'll be less than 5%. This is one of those, I wouldn't call it a miracle, but it's something close to a miracle, how the community has responded and how the response has brought people together in ways that I don't think they ever imagined. New friendships have been made. New lines of communication have been formed. New organizations have been created, all for the benefit of Lafayette.
And so the final question is, why do you think the citizens of Lafayette have responded so enthusiastically, as you have explained?
Right. No, yeah, that's a great question.
Why?
I think at this point, I think it is embedded in our DNA. Lafayette has for 50 or 60 years been known for having a good system of public education. And that has in part led to a self-selecting population who choose to move here. I think it's fair to say, I've not seen any data or any studies that prove it, but I think it's reasonable to say, to theorize, to argue that many people, if not most people who move to Lafayette, move here for the quality public education. And this phenomena has now occurred for 3 or 4 generations, and so we've kind of stacked the town with people who care about learning and public education and who are caretakers of public institutions. I believe every single parcel tax for schools that has ever been promoted in Lafayette has passed. And so people are in the habit of supporting public education and public institutions. They understand that by doing so, they create a successful community and enrich not only their lives, but their children's lives and their children's friends' lives, and create a legacy for generations who follow behind them. And so I think it's reasonable to say that those decades of support for public education and that self-selecting population was ready to support a library. And when the right parcel became available, and then when the right architect developed the right building, and then when we were able to capture that state grant, it serves as a financial foundation. It really broadcast a signal to the Lafayette population that this was going to be another successful public institution. And because the habit was there to support public institutions and public education, they came through.